for most of human history all's a sim. There is no refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, no freezer full of forgotten vegetables, and certainly no helpful little date stamped on a package telling you when your supper has become suspicious. A piece of meat left in summer heat can begin changing within hours. Milk turns sour, fish softens, fruit bruises and ferments. Grain attracts insects that seem to regard your winter provisions as a personal invitation, and yet people survive. You stand in an ancient settlement at the end of a warm day, surrounded by baskets of grain, clay jars, hanging cuts of meat, bundles of herbs, and perhaps a few fish carried up from a nearby river. Everything here represents work, days of work, sometimes months. Losing food is not merely annoying, it can mean hunger when the weather changes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me where in the world you are listening from and what the local time is for you. Now, dim the lights, and imagine that the soft electrical hum of the modern kitchen simply disappears. What remains is silence, broken perhaps by insects outside, a dog shifting near the doorway, and the occasional scrape of pottery against packed earth. You're entering a world in which freshness is not measured in printed dates. It is measured with your eyes, your fingers, your nose, and a lifetime of experience. Food preservation begins with a very simple problem. Living things do not remain conveniently edible forever. Once an animal is killed, a fruit is picked, or milk leaves the animal that produced it, a series of natural processes begins. Microorganisms multiply, enzymes continue working, moisture encourages decay, warm temperatures generally speed everything along. Ancient people do not know about bacteria in the modern scientific sense. Nobody's leaning thoughtfully over a bowl and explaining microbial reproduction. Still, observation is a powerful teacher. You do not need a microscope to notice that meat lasts longer in cold weather. You do not need laboratory equipment to discover that wet grain develops unpleasant smells, or that a fish left in the sun behaves differently from one hung in a dry breeze. Generation after generation, communities collect these observations. Records confirm that ancient civilizations developed sophisticated systems for storing food thousands of years before anyone understood the microscopic organisms responsible for spoilage. Archaeological sites revealed granaries or storage pits, sealed jars, drying installations, and other evidence showing that preservation is not some occasional household trick. It becomes part of the infrastructure of civilization itself. The scale of the problem is easy to underestimate from the comfort of a supermarket. Think about a harvest. For months, you prepare soil, sow seed, protect young plants, watch the sky, worry about rainfall, chase animals away, and finally gather the crop. Then, almost absurdly, the moment the grain is harvested, another problem begins. Now you have to keep it. Moisture is dangerous. Rodents are persistent. Beetles are tiny, determined, and apparently unconcerned by your agricultural ambitions. A storehouse might contain enough food to support a household through winter, or an entire community until the next harvest. If pests reach it, there is no emergency delivery truck arriving tomorrow morning. This is why ancient storage often looks less like casual housekeeping and more like defensive architecture. You raise containers from damp ground, you plaster walls, you seal openings, you inspect grain repeatedly, you remove damaged portions before they spread trouble through the rest, and you listen. A faint rustling inside a storage basket can be bad news. Imagine placing your hand against a clay vessel late at night. The surface is cool and slightly rough. Nearby, dried grasses smell dusty and sweet. Somewhere in the roof beams, a mouse makes a noise just loud enough to ruin your sense of security. Food preservation is partly chemistry, partly architecture, and partly an endless argument with creatures smaller than you. Heat creates another problem. In warm regions, Fresh animal products can deteriorate quickly. A successful hunt produces abundance, but abundance itself creates urgency. If several hunters return with more meat than everyone can eat immediately, you face a strange kind of emergency. You have succeeded too well. Modern abundance allows waste to feel distant. Ancient abundance demands decisions. What gets eaten tonight? What is shared with neighbours? What must be processed immediately? What can survive until tomorrow? The answer often depends on season, climate, local resources, and social habits. A coastal community may handle food differently from people living on a dry plateau. A farming village has different challenges from a mobile herding group. Communities near salt deposits possess opportunities unavailable to those far inland. There is no single ancient preservation method. There is instead a toolkit slowly assembled across thousands of years. Even before permanent cities appear, humans learn that certain places naturally protect food better than others. A cool cave offers different conditions from an exposed shelter. Dry air behaves differently from humid air. Winter temperatures can become temporary allies. Your mind drifts toward a family returning from a hunt in a colder season. Meat can remain usable longer simply because the surrounding air slows spoilage. Nobody needs to explain the chemistry. They only need to remember what happened last winter. Human survival depends heavily on this kind of memory. The elder who knows which berries dry well matters. The person who recognizes spoiled meat by smell matters. The household member who knows that a particular storage pit floods during heavy rain matters. Preservation knowledge becomes social knowledge. That matters because food is rarely only about calories. It is tied to hospitality, obligation, status, ritual, trade, and family relationships. If you possess a surplus, someone else may expect to share. If another household helped during harvest, repayment might arrive in grain or preserved meat. A community surviving a poor season may depend on stores accumulated during a good one. And yes, occasionally the greatest threat to your food supply has two legs and perfectly good manners. Food theft appears throughout human history for the obvious reason that stored food is valuable. A granary full of grain is concentrated labour. It represents land, rainfall, seed, work, and future meals all sitting in one tempting location. Protecting food therefore means protecting it not only from decay but from other people. Walls, locked rooms, guarded storehouses, and administrative control gradually become part of the story. As societies grow larger, rulers quickly discover that whoever controls stored food possesses extraordinary power. Temples, palaces, estates, military institutions, and governments collect and redistribute grain. Stored food can pay workers, it can support soldiers, it can feed cities during shortages. A jar of grain may look humble, but multiply it by 10,000, and suddenly you have politics. Scholars bicker over exactly how strongly large-scale food storage encouraged the rise of centralized authority in different early societies. Some emphasize the administrative power created by controlling agricultural surplus. Others warn that ancient communities are too varied to fit neatly into one explanation. The argument continues because food storage leaves evidence, but social relationships are more difficult to reconstruct. A granary tells you grain was stored. It does not always tell you whether people handed that grain over willingly. Still, one thing is clear. Once food can be preserved beyond the moment of harvest, human possibilities expand dramatically. You can remain in one place longer. You can survive seasons when little grows. You can support craftspeople who are not farming every day. You can provision travellers. You can maintain armies. You can build cities whose populations cannot possibly gather all their food within walking distance. Preservation quietly stretches time. That may be the most useful way to think about it. Fresh food belongs to the present. Preserved food allows the present to feed the future. A basket of grain harvested in late summer becomes a meal in winter. A piece of meat processed after a successful hunt becomes nourishment weeks or months later. Fruit gathered during a brief season can appear when the tree itself stands bare. You are, in a sense, storing sunlight. The energy of one season waits for another. Oddly enough, some ancient storage traditions may have benefited from smoke, ash, particular clays, plant materials, or household conditions long before anyone could explain why. Practices survive because they appear to work, even when the explanation attached to them is imaginative. Perhaps a certain container is preferred because grandparents insisted is lucky. Perhaps grain stored near a particular hearth lasts longer. The family may credit tradition or divine favour, while the practical reason involves dryness, smoke, insects, or temperature. Ancient preservation lives in this comfortable mixture of careful observation and beliefs that modern science would not recognise. And you should probably resist the temptation to feel superior. You too have likely stared into a refrigerator, inspected something questionable, sniffed it cautiously, and attempted a small private experiment in food safety. The technology improves. The hesitation remains timeless. Another important difference separates your kitchen from theirs. You expect consistency. Ancient people expect variation. One year is wet, another is dry. Summer arrives unusually hot. A river floods, locusts appear, livestock become sick. A neighbouring settlement offers trade one season and trouble the next. Preservation is therefore not simply about enjoying food later, it is insurance. Every stored basket is a small defence against uncertainty. This changes the way people think about food. Waste carries emotional weight because replacing what is lost may be difficult or impossible. A spoiled jar is not merely unpleasant, it represents vanished labour. You can picture someone lifting the lid from a storage vessel and immediately sensing something is wrong. The smell reaches you first. Perhaps dampness entered. Perhaps insects found a way inside. Perhaps mould has spread across the surface. There is a quiet frustration in that moment, one familiar to anyone who has ever discovered forgotten food at the back of a refrigerator. Except here, the consequences are considerably less amusing. So households learn caution. Food is inspected, turned, separated, dried, moved, covered, uncovered, and watched. Children learn by observing adults. Methods are repeated until they become custom. Custom becomes tradition. Tradition becomes knowledge so ordinary that nobody thinks to describe it. This is one reason the history of everyday preservation can be difficult to reconstruct. Grand monuments announce themselves. A humble storage habit does not. Kings carve victories into stone. People rarely carve instructions saying, "Remember to keep the grain dry, and please check for beetles on Thursday." Yet these quiet skills sustain the people who build the monuments. Without preserved food, the impressive parts of ancient history become much harder to imagine. The stone workers need meals. The sailors need provisions. The merchants need supplies that survive travel. The soldiers need something in their packs. The children need food when crops are not ready. Behind the temples and palaces, roads, ships, and armies stands the less dramatic reality of someone worrying about dinner several months from now. For a moment, it feels as though the ancient settlement around you becomes quieter. The day's work is nearly finished. Jars stand against a wall. Grain rests in baskets. A cooking fire settles into glowing coals. Someone checks a lid one final time before sleeping. Nothing here guarantees safety. There is always another insect, another humid day, another hungry animal, another uncertain season. But there is also accumulated experience. People have learned that food can be persuaded to last. Not forever, just longer. And sometimes, longer is enough. Enough to reach winter, enough to cross a dry season, enough to finish a journey, as enough to feed a child until the next harvest ripens. The room darkens and the scents of grain, clay, smoke and dried herbs settle into the evening air. Outside, the night insects continue their steady rhythm. Inside, tomorrow's meals wait quietly in jars and baskets, protected as carefully as ancient hands know how. The problem of freshness has not been solved. It has simply become something humans can bargain with. You lift a strip of meat between your fingers and notice how different it feels from something freshly cut. The surface is darker, firmer, almost leathery, and when you bend it, there is resistance. It has lost something invisible but essential: water. That simple loss changes everything. In a dry landscape, preservation can begin without salt, smoke, jars, or underground chambers. All you need is moving air, low humidity, and enough patience to let nature do the work without allowing insects, rain, or curious animals to interfere. Drying is one of the oldest food preservation techniques humans ever use because it relies on a basic fact of biology. Many organisms that spoil food need moisture. Remove enough of that moisture, and their activity slows dramatically. Ancient people do not describe this in terms of water activity or microbial growth. They simply notice that wet food goes bad faster than dry food. So you begin looking at the landscape differently. A sunny rock is not merely a sunny rock. A breezy hillside is not merely a pleasant place to stand. A flat roof, an elevated rack, a woven mat, or the branch of a tree can become a preservation tool. The air itself becomes part of the kitchen. Imagine a morning in a dry valley. The sun is still low, but heat is beginning to gather against stone walls. Thin pieces of meat lie across a raised frame. Nearby, sliced fruit rests on reed mats. Herbs are tied in bundles where air can move around them. Nothing looks especially technological. There are no gears, no metal machines, no humming motors. And yet this is controlled processing. Thickness matters, placement matters, timing matters. If slices are too thick, the outside may dry while moisture remains trapped within. If pieces touch each other, damp surfaces can linger. If evening dew arrives before the food is moved or covered, an entire day of drying can be partly undone. You quickly discover that drying food is less passive than it appears. Someone must watch the sky. Someone must turn the pieces. Someone must chase flies away. Someone must decide when the food is ready. Records confirm that dried foods appear across ancient societies in environments ranging from North Africa and the Near East to Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and the Americas. Grain, fish, meat, grapes, dates, figs, and herbs all lend themselves to drying under the right conditions. Grain is especially well suited to this method. Once harvested, cereal grains naturally contain far less water than fresh meat or fruit, but they still need careful drying before long storage. If grain is brought in damp after rain, trouble can begin inside the pile. You push your hand into a basket and feel warmth. That is not always reassuring. Moist grain can heat as biological activity continues. Mold may develop, insects flourish. Seeds can even begin to germinate if conditions are right. So people spread grain in thin layers. They expose it to sun. They stir it. They listen to the sound it makes when poured. Experienced hands learn the difference between grain that is properly dry and grain still carrying too much moisture. There is something soothing about the rhythm. A wooden rake moves slowly across a courtyard. Kernels scrape over packed earth or plaster. The sun warms your shoulders. A faint, dusty smell rises whenever the grain turns. Then someone runs a handful through their fingers and judges the result without instruments. It is knowledge stored in the body. Fruit presents a different challenge because it contains so much water and sugar. A fresh grape is plump and fragile. Leave it carelessly in heat, and it may split, mould, or ferment. Dry it carefully, and it becomes a raisin. The transformation is almost magical in its simplicity. Water leaves, sugar becomes concentrated, the fruit shrinks, flavour intensifies, A food that once bruised easily now travels much better. Dates behave similarly. Figs too. Across warm regions, dried fruits become valuable because they pack energy into small, durable forms. You can carry them on journeys. You can trade them. You can store them for leaner months. You can hand one to a tired traveller and discover that hospitality becomes considerably easier when the snack does not spoil by lunchtime. Even here, though, drying requires judgment. Too much heat can harden an exterior too quickly. Too little airflow invites mould. Dust settles. Birds investigate. Insects arrive with the confidence of creatures who have never once contributed to the harvest. People improvise barriers. Fine cloth may cover food. Raised racks may keep it away from dirt. Smoke from a nearby fire may discourage insects even when smoking is not the primary preservation method. One curious footnote is that in some dry regions, people learn to use hot stones or sun-warmed surfaces to speed drying, turning parts of the landscape into temporary food processing stations. A flat stone that spends all afternoon absorbing heat can become surprisingly useful by evening. Fish demands even more speed. A fish leaves the water already carrying high moisture and delicate tissues. In warm conditions, it deteriorates quickly. So coastal communities and river communities develop routines that begin almost immediately after the catch. Fish are cleaned. Sometimes they are split open to expose more surface area. They may be hung from frames, arranged on racks, or laid where wind can reach them. The goal is simple: make the piece thinner and increase contact with moving air. You hear gulls overhead. Rope creaks. Wooden poles knock gently against one another. The smell is strong, salty even before extra salt enters the process. Hands work quickly because delay is expensive. On a good drying day, weather becomes a collaborator. On a bad one, it becomes an adversary. Humidity is the quiet enemy. Drying works best when the air can accept more moisture. In very humid conditions, food releases water slowly, and mould may gain time to establish itself. This creates regional differences. A method that works beautifully in an arid inland valley may fail miserably in a damp coastal climate. Ancient preservation is therefore deeply local. People do not simply ask, "How do humans dry food?" They ask, "How do we dry food here? What does our wind do? When does dew form? Which month brings rain? How strong is the midday sun? Where are the flies worst?" Local expertise becomes more important than any universal rule. Your hands learn to read weather. You feel the air against your skin. You notice whether cloth left outside stays crisp or becomes limp. You watch clouds build over distant hills. The same senses used for farming are now used for preservation. Meat requires perhaps the most careful attention. Large chunks dry poorly. Thin strips perform better. Cutting meat into narrow pieces increases the amount of surface exposed to air, allowing moisture to escape more quickly. This is one reason dried meat traditions around the world often involve strips, sheets, or small pieces rather than enormous untouched portions. You take a knife and work along the muscle. The blade is not perfectly smooth. The cutting board is rough. Your hands become slick at first, then gradually drier as the strips are arranged. Now the wind begins its work. Hours pass, then perhaps another day. Texture changes slowly. Colour deepens. The smell becomes more concentrated. The food becomes lighter. That last change matters enormously for travel. Water is heavy. When you remove it, food weighs less. For people moving across long distances, dried food provides a remarkable advantage. You can carry more calories without carrying the same amount of water locked inside the food itself. Travelers appreciate this. Herders appreciate it. Hunters appreciate it. Soldiers eventually appreciate it very much. A bag of dried meat or fruit occupies less space and survives conditions that would ruin fresh equivalents. Drying, therefore, changes mobility. It makes food portable. It helps people travel beyond places where fresh supplies are guaranteed. And naturally, scholars bicker over exactly how important early dried foods are in supporting long-distance movement in different prehistoric communities. The evidence can be difficult to interpret because dried food rarely leaves a convenient label announcing how it was processed. A fragment of animal bone may reveal diet, a charred seed may reveal a plant, but a dried slice of meat can disappear almost completely. Archaeologists sometimes have to infer preservation practices from tools, settlement patterns, environmental conditions, residues, and comparisons with later traditions. That means the history of drying contains many sensible reconstructions, but also some uncertainty. You can be confident that humans discover drying very early. You cannot always know precisely what a particular family hangs from a rack on a particular afternoon 10,000 years ago. There is also a blurred line between deliberate preservation and accidental discovery. Perhaps someone leaves strips of meat near a dry breeze and notices that they remain edible longer. Perhaps fruit shrivels naturally on a branch and tastes unexpectedly sweet. Perhaps grain scattered after harvest becomes dry enough to keep. You do not need a grand invention moment. No ancient genius necessarily stands up and declares the discovery of dehydration. More likely, useful accidents become repeated habits. Repeated habits become techniques. Techniques become traditions. Eventually, you know what to do almost without thinking. The smell of properly drying food becomes familiar. The texture becomes familiar. The dangers become familiar too. Flies are among the most persistent. They land quickly on exposed food, especially meat and fish. People swat them away, cover food loosely, raise racks, choose windier locations, or process food during conditions when insect pressure is lower. Wind is useful not just because it removes moisture. It can also make life difficult for flying insects. That creates a small but important advantage. The best drying place may not be the hottest place. It may be the place where heat, shade, and airflow balance properly. Direct sunlight is not always ideal for every food. Herbs, for example, may lose colour or aroma under harsh sun, so people may dry them in shade where air still circulates. Leaves are tied in bunches, stems hang downward, the scent fills a sheltered corner. Mint, thyme, sage, whatever grows locally. You brush past and release more aroma into the air. Dry herbs waste almost nothing, yet they carry flavour for months. They also become useful in medicine, ritual, and household practice. A plant gathered during one season can remain available when the landscape changes. Drying preserves not only calories but possibility. Even mushrooms can be dried where people know which varieties are safe. Roots can be sliced, seeds can be spread, seaweed can be dried along shorelines. Different environments offer different candidates. The principle remains beautifully uncomplicated. Expose food to conditions that remove moisture faster than spoilage can take hold. That sounds easy. In practice, it is a race, and ancient families become very good at racing. You look across a courtyard near late afternoon. The sunlight has softened. The hottest part of the day is fading. Someone lifts a mat and carries it indoors before evening dampness settles. Another person gathers herb bundles. A rack of meat is checked piece by piece. Nothing is rushed now, but nothing is neglected. Drying has its own pace. Too little time and food remains vulnerable. Too much exposure, and it can become excessively hard, brittle, dusty, or damaged. So fingers press, noses judge, teeth sometimes test. Experience decides. There is no electronic timer, there is only familiarity. And oddly enough, familiarity can be extraordinarily precise. A skilled person can tell from the bend of a strip, the sound of grain, or the feel of a fruit whether enough moisture has left. The process feels almost quiet from a distance. Sun, air, time? Yet beneath that quietness is a sophisticated understanding built from thousands of small observations. You stand beside the drying racks as evening cools the stones under your feet. The breeze still moves. The food is lighter now than when the day began. Some of its water has vanished into the air, invisible and irretrievable. What remains is more concentrated, more durable, and far more likely to survive long enough to matter. For ancient hands, that is not a minor kitchen trick. It is a way of turning a brief moment of abundance into something that can travel through time. You press 2 fingers into a shallow bowl of coarse white crystals and feel their sharp edges catch against your skin. The grains are uneven, some nearly transparent, some cloudy, all of them precious. Salt looks ordinary to you now. In an ancient household, it can be anything but ordinary. A pinch changes flavour. A handful changes how long food survives. Enough of it can determine whether meat lasts through a journey, whether fish reaches an inland market, or whether a household carries protein into a season when fresh supplies become scarce. The useful trick is not mysterious once you understand it. Salt draws water out of food. It also makes the remaining moisture less friendly to many of the organisms responsible for spoilage. Ancient people do not describe osmotic pressure or microbial cells. They simply see the result. Meat packed with salt lasts longer. Fish treated with salt keeps better than fish left untreated. Vegetables submerged in salty liquid change slowly, rather than collapsing into immediate decay. Observation does the teaching. Your first problem is getting the salt. If you live near the sea, the answer may seem obvious, but turning seawater into usable salt requires effort. You collect salty water in shallow containers or basins, and allow sun and wind to evaporate the water away. Slowly, crystals remain. The process is beautifully simple and annoyingly dependent on weather. A dry, hot day helps. Rain does not. Clouds slow everything. Wind can be useful, unless it arrives carrying sand, dust, or whatever the neighbourhood goats have recently decided to kick into the air. In other regions, salt comes from natural springs, salt lakes, exposed deposits, or underground mines. That means geography matters enormously. Some communities sit near abundant salt, others must trade for it. And once trade becomes involved, something that began as a humble mineral can become a strategic commodity. Records confirm that ancient states and trading communities moved salt across considerable distances because it was useful not only for flavour, but for food preservation, animal care, and other daily needs. You can imagine the caravan before you see it. Leather straps creak. Pack animals step carefully over hard ground. Dust hangs behind them. Among the goods are blocks, cakes, bags, or lumps of salt, depending on where you are and how it has been produced. To modern eyes, transporting salt might sound underwhelming. No jewels, no silk, no glittering treasure, just salt. But try feeding a large population without reliable preservation, and suddenly those pale crystals become far more impressive. Their value lies in extending time. Suppose a fisherman brings in a heavy catch. The fish are fresh now. That condition will not last. You clean them quickly, removing parts that spoil fastest. Then you rub salt onto exposed flesh. Sometimes you pack fish in layers. Fish, salt, fish, salt. The crystals begin pulling moisture outward. Liquid collects. The flesh firms. Its texture changes beneath your fingers. The sharp scent of fresh fish becomes mingled with mineral brine. If you use enough salt and control the process well, the fish last far longer than it otherwise would. This changes fishing itself. A catch no longer has to be eaten entirely near the shore. Preserved fish can move inland. It can become a trade good. It can feed travellers and workers. It can become a regular part of diets far from the water where it was caught. That is a major transformation. Geography becomes less strict. A person living days from the coast can still eat marine fish, because preservation loosens the relationship between where food is produced and where it is consumed. The same principle applies to meat. Freshly butchered meat contains substantial moisture. Salt rubbed across its surface begins drawing some of that moisture out. For thicker cuts, surface salting alone may not be enough, so repeated rubbing, packing, or immersion becomes useful. You work the salt into creases. The crystals scratch against your fingertips. Your hands become dry. The smell is strong but clean, dominated by meat and mineral rather than smoke. Then comes waiting. Preservation is full of waiting. The food changes while apparently doing nothing. Liquid seeps away. The texture tightens. Salt moves inward. Sometimes the food is later dried as well, combining two preservation techniques in a single process. Ancient cooks do not have to choose one method and remain loyal to it like supporters of rival athletic teams. They combine whatever works: salt plus drying, salt plus smoke, salt plus fermentation. The methods overlap because preservation is practical, not philosophical. You use what keeps the food edible. Brine offers another approach. Instead of rubbing dry salt directly onto food, you dissolve it in water. Now the preserving environment surrounds whatever you place inside. Vegetables can be submerged, fish can be immersed, pieces of meat can sit beneath the surface. The strength of the brine matters. Too weak, and spoilage may outrun preservation. Very strong brine behaves differently and can produce food that must later be soaked or cooked to reduce its saltiness. Without measuring cups or laboratory instruments, you rely on practical tests. In later traditional practices, people sometimes judge brine strength with floating objects, including eggs, fruit, or other items whose buoyancy changes as the liquid becomes saltier. A curious footnote is that such household tests can appear surprisingly scientific, even when nobody involved speaks in scientific language. You place something into the brine. If it floats in the expected way, the mixture is judged strong enough. The kitchen becomes a small laboratory. Nobody wears a white coat. Someone may be barefoot. A chicken may walk through at exactly the wrong moment. Still, the principle works. Brining vegetables produces particularly interesting results because salt does more than delay ordinary spoilage. At certain concentrations, it favours some microorganisms while suppressing others. This can lead directly toward controlled fermentation. Cabbage, cucumbers, roots, olives, and other plant foods can transform in salty environments. The smell changes, the acidity changes, texture changes. The final food may taste almost unrelated to the fresh ingredient. The boundary between salting and fermentation can become delightfully blurry. You intend to keep vegetables from rotting. Microbes perform an invisible negotiation. Dinner emerges. Olives give you a good example of why preservation is sometimes also preparation. Fresh olives straight from the tree can be intensely bitter because of compounds within the fruit. They are not simply plucked and eaten by the bowlful while everyone congratulates the tree. They usually require processing. Brining becomes one way to make them pleasant to eat while also helping them keep. You place the olives into liquid, days pass, then more days. The fruit slowly changes, bitterness diminishes, flavour develops. A preserved food is created not by freezing freshness in place, but by deliberately transforming the original ingredient. That distinction matters. Modern advertising often treats freshness as the highest possible virtue. Ancient preservation frequently works by accepting that food will change. The goal is not always to preserve the exact texture and flavour of the fresh product. The goal is to guide change in a useful direction. Salted fish does not taste like fresh fish. Cured meat does not behave like fresh meat. Brined olives do not resemble raw olives in flavour. Transformation is not failure, it is the technique. You begin to notice how this affects ancient taste preferences. People become accustomed to strong flavours, salt, acidity, concentrated meat, fermented aromas, dried textures. These are not emergency foods eaten only with resignation. Many become desirable in their own right. A preservation method can create a delicacy. That is one of history's pleasant little accidents. You start trying to stop food from spoiling and end up inventing something people actively crave. Salted fish sauces offer an especially pungent example. Across parts of the ancient Mediterranean and Asia, people produced fermented or salted fish preparations with intense savoury flavours. Fish parts, and salt may be left to transform over time until a strongly flavoured liquid or paste emerges. To modern noses unfamiliar with such processes, the smell can seem alarming. To ancient cooks, it can be magnificent. A small amount adds depth to food. One scandalous aside is that ancient fish processing areas can become notorious for their aroma. Large quantities of fish sitting with salt under warm conditions do not exactly produce the scent of a spring garden. You can almost imagine a homeowner complaining that the neighbours have once again chosen the hottest week of the year to process several hundred fish. Yet those smells represent valuable production. The preserved results can travel much farther than fresh fish. Amphorae and other containers carry salted fish products through trade networks. A kitchen far from the original coastline can open a vessel and taste something created weeks or months earlier. Salt does not merely preserve food, it helps create markets. And wherever valuable goods move, authorities become interested. Rulers tax salt, merchants organize its transport, communities fight for access to sources, workers extract it under difficult conditions. Control over salt can provide revenue and political leverage. The humble condiment begins acquiring a rather impressive resume. You may have heard sweeping claims that entire civilizations rise and fall because of salt. Such statements can become exaggerated. Historians still argue whether salt should be treated as a primary driver of certain trade routes and political developments, or as one important commodity among many. The answer varies from place to place. In some regions, salt is abundant and relatively accessible. In others, it is scarce enough to command substantial value. Its importance depends on environment, population, diet, transportation, and local alternatives. What remains certain is that preserved food often makes long-distance movement easier. Imagine provisioning a journey without it. Fresh meat must be consumed quickly. Fresh fish is worse. Milk is difficult. Many fruits bruise. A traveller dependent entirely on fresh food must constantly find new supplies. Salted products change the equation. You can pack preserved meat into containers. You can carry salted fish. You can transport hard, salty foods that tolerate heat and handling better than fresh equivalents. The flavour may be intense. You may need water afterward. You will probably become intimately familiar with thirst, but your food survives. For armies and ships, that reliability is priceless. Large groups of people consume astonishing quantities of food. A marching force cannot simply hope that a convenient bakery appears round every bend. A ship cannot stop in the middle of open water and ask the sea for fresh vegetables. Preserved provisions reduce dependence on immediate local supplies. Salt becomes part of the invisible logistics behind movement. The same is true in households on a smaller scale. A family may preserve meat after slaughter because keeping an animal alive until needed is one form of food storage. But once the animal is butchered, the clock starts moving quickly. Preserving surplus allows the value of that animal to stretch across many meals. That can be especially important when slaughter is seasonal. Cooler weather may make processing easier. Salted and dried cuts can then remain available long after the original day of butchery. You enter a storeroom and smell them before your eyes adjust. The air is dry. Clay jars line a wall. A container holds heavily salted fish. Another contains olives beneath brine. Bundles of preserved meat hang above. A few grains of salt sparkle where someone spilled them onto a wooden surface. There is nothing luxurious about the room. Yet it contains time. Food gathered on different days sits together, each item held in a deliberate state between freshness and decay. You lift the lid from a brining jar. The smell rises quickly. Strong, sour, mineral, perhaps slightly funky, you hesitate. Someone beside you does not. They know exactly what it should smell like. That knowledge is critical. Preservation techniques require people to distinguish desirable transformation from dangerous spoilage. Colour matters, odour matters, texture matters, gas bubbles may matter, surface growth matters. A household learns what is normal. Mistakes can be serious. So experience carries weight. There are no printed instructions attached to the jar. The instructions live in people. A child watches how much salt an adult uses. They notice the size of the handful. They see how tightly food is packed. They learn which jars stay in shade. They learn when the liquid should be replaced. Years later, their own hands repeat the same motions. This is how preservation knowledge travels through generations, quietly and mostly without written explanation. By late evening, the salt on your fingertips has begun to sting tiny cracks in your skin. You rinse your hands. The water tastes faintly mineral where droplets touch your lips. Nearby, a jar settles with a soft ceramic scrape as it is pushed back against the wall. Its contents are no longer fresh in the modern sense. They are becoming something more durable. Salt has altered their future. A fish that might have lasted only briefly can now travel. A piece of meat can wait. A vegetable can transform instead of simply collapsing. The crystals themselves remain small enough to disappear beneath your fingernail. Yet, in the ancient kitchen, few things so tiny possess so much power. In your ears, the crackle of a low fire changes into something steadier, almost hypnotic. Wood shifts softly in the hearth. A faint ribbon of smoke curls upward, carrying the scent of oak, pine, dung fuel, or whatever burns well in the place you happen to call home. Above that fire, food hangs, not directly in the flames. That would be dinner, not preservation. Instead, strips of meat or whole fish sit where smoke can reach them slowly, hour after hour, while heat and moving air remove moisture from their surfaces. You soon discover that smoke is doing several jobs at once. The warmth helps dry the food. The moving air carries moisture away. Compounds in the smoke settle onto the surface, creating flavours and conditions that can slow the activity of some microorganisms. Ancient cooks do not describe phenols or antimicrobial compounds. They know something simpler. Food kept in smoke behaves differently. It lasts longer, it smells different. It tastes different. And because fires already burn for warmth and cooking, smoke is practically unavoidable. This makes smoking one of those preservation methods that may emerge without anyone setting out to invent it. Picture a household where meat is hung from roof beams to keep it away from dogs, children, insects, and damp ground. The hearth burns below every day. Smoke gathers beneath the roof because there is no modern chimney efficiently carrying it away. Days pass. Someone notices that the meat hanging in the smoky rafters keeps surprisingly well. That observation is worth remembering. Soon, placement becomes intentional. A beam close to the hearth may be better for certain foods. Another position may become too hot. A corner with little airflow might encourage dampness. What begins as architecture turns into technique. The ancient house itself becomes a preservation machine. Records confirm that hearth smoke has been used for preserving meat and fish across many cultures, often together with drying or salting rather than as a completely separate process. That combination matters. Smoking alone is not magic. A thick, wet piece of meat left in weak smoke can still spoil. Successful preservation depends on reducing moisture enough, controlling temperature, and sometimes adding salt first. So you prepare the food carefully. A fish may be split open, meat may be cut into smaller portions, salt might be rubbed across the surface. Then the pieces are suspended where smoke can move around them. Your face begins to sting, your eyes water. The room is warm near the fire but cool at your back. Soot darkens the rafters overhead. Every surface seems to carry a faint, smoky scent. To you. raised in a world of ventilation systems and smoke alarms. The room may feel unpleasantly thick. To the people living here, the smoke can be part nuisance, part tool, and part familiar smell of home. There are different ways to smoke food. Hotter smoke can cook while preserving. Cooler smoke dries more slowly and changes flavour without fully cooking the food at once. Ancient households do not necessarily divide these techniques into neat modern categories, but they certainly notice that distance from the fire changes the result. Too close, and fat drips. Too hot, and the outside cooks quickly while the interior remains moist. Too far away, and preservation slows. The correct height may be marked not by a measuring tape, but by memory. You know which hook works. You know which beam. You know that a certain fire produces useful smoke, and another fills the room with bitter soot. Wood choice matters too. Different fuels create different flavours. Hardwoods can produce a steady smoke. Resinous woods may make harsher flavours. In regions where trees are scarce, people burn shrubs, reeds, crop residues, peat, or dried animal dung. Yes, dung. Ancient fuel choices are governed less by romance and more by availability. If you live somewhere without forests, you burn what you have. Oddly enough, dried animal dung can produce a slow, dependable heat and has been used as fuel in many pastoral societies. The idea may sound alarming until you remember that once thoroughly dried, it behaves more like compact plant fibre than the fresh material you are imagining. Still, if you were hoping every ancient kitchen smelled like cedar and rosemary, history would like to adjust your expectations. Smokehouses eventually offer more controlled conditions in some communities. Instead of relying only on the household hearth, people create spaces where food can hang above a managed fire or smouldering fuel. You step inside one and immediately feel the difference. The light is dim, the ceiling disappears behind a haze, rows of meat or fish hang from wooden poles, fat shines faintly on some surfaces. The floor feels gritty beneath your feet. The fire itself may be small because large flames are not always desirable. You want smoke, you want steady warmth. You do not want to accidentally turn an entire season's provisions into charcoal. That distinction requires attention. Someone tends the fire, someone adds damp wood or adjusts airflow, someone moves the food. Preservation is still work even when the smoke appears to be doing everything. Fish responds especially well because it can be opened and exposed efficiently. In coastal and riverine communities, smoking allows a large catch to survive long enough to move away from the water. You can imagine rows of fish hanging near a shore settlement. Wind carries salt and smoke together. Birds complain from a safe distance. The fish gradually become firmer. Their skin darkens. The surface acquires a glossy or smoky coating. Now they can travel farther. A trader can carry them inland. A household can keep them longer. A boat crew can take them on a journey. A preservation technique has once again stretched geography. Meat benefits too, especially when slaughter produces more than a household can consume quickly. Smoking is useful because it transforms surplus into a slower food. That phrase sounds odd, but it fits. Fresh meat demands immediate attention. Smoked meat waits, not indefinitely. Ancient preservation is rarely about making something immortal. It is about buying enough time to cross a difficult interval, a week, a month, a season. Whatever the method can safely provide under local conditions, you become aware that flavour changes during the process. This is important because preserved food is not merely tolerated. People often come to enjoy it. Smoke creates aromas that become deeply associated with particular regions, families, or traditions. A certain wood produces a familiar taste. A particular household becomes known for its fish. A community develops preferences that would be difficult to separate from preservation itself. The practical method becomes cuisine. This happens again and again in food history, where a technique begins as necessity Then people improve it. Then people become opinionated about it. Soon someone is insisting that the neighbours smoke their meat completely wrong. Human civilization is progressing nicely. A curious footnote appears in the architecture of older houses, where food can be hung high above domestic fires for long periods, sometimes in places modern occupants would consider absurdly smoky. Those roof spaces collect soot year after year. The blackened beams become evidence of countless meals, countless winters, and countless small decisions about where food should hang. The smoke leaves marks not only on meat but on buildings. It also leaves marks on people. Indoor smoke can irritate eyes and lungs. This creates a darker side to the cosy image of the ancient hearth. The same fire that warms the room, cooks dinner, deters insects, and helps preserve food also fills enclosed spaces with pollutants. Women, children, servants, or anyone spending long hours near domestic fires may receive heavy exposure. The ancient home can smell comforting while being physically harsh. Preservation always involves trade-offs. You gain durability, you endure smoke, you gain warmth, you breathe soot, you protect meat, you spend hours tending a fire. No technique arrives without cost. Even the smoke itself must be controlled. If food becomes coated in too much soot, flavour suffers. If temperatures remain too low while the food stays wet, spoilage can continue. If the fire flares suddenly, carefully prepared provisions may burn. You watch the coals instead of the flames. A good smoking fire often looks unimpressive. It smoulders, it glows, it sends up persistent smoke. The kind of fire a child might complain is not doing anything useful is exactly the kind you may want. Patience matters more than spectacle. Scholars bicker over how early deliberate smoking can be confidently distinguished from simple exposure to hearth smoke in prehistoric communities. The difficulty is obvious once you think about it. Smoke rarely leaves a tidy written label. Animal bones near a hearth do not automatically prove that the meat was preserved rather than cooked. Blackened structures can indicate repeated fires without revealing exactly what hung above them. Archaeologists therefore examine patterns of burning settlement design. Food remains, ethnographic parallels, and experimental work. No agreement has been reached on every early case, but deliberate smoking is unquestionably ancient, and its logic is easy to understand wherever people use fire regularly. Sometimes necessity may guide discovery. A hunter returns during wet weather when ordinary sun drying is difficult. The air outside refuses to cooperate. Inside, however, the hearth is warm and dry, food hangs above it, smoke surrounds it. The result lasts. You do not need a scientific breakthrough. You need an inconvenient rainy week and a good memory. Climate shapes the method in other ways too. In damp places, smoke can help when air drying alone is unreliable. In cold regions, a fire provides both warmth and drying. In heavily wooded areas, fuel may be abundant enough for prolonged smoking. Where fuel is scarce, the technique becomes more expensive. Every preservation method quietly reflects the environment around it. You begin to see the ancient kitchen as a map of local resources. Clay suggests pottery. Salt suggests mines or coasts. Smoke suggests fuel. Drying suggests sun and wind. People build preservation strategies from the landscape available to them. They are not choosing from a universal cookbook. They are negotiating with geography. The smell around you thickens as fresh fuel is added. For a few moments, your eyes sting badly enough that you step toward the doorway. Outside, evening air feels cool against your face. Behind you, smoke slips through gaps in the roof. Inside, food continues changing. The process is slow enough that nothing dramatic seems to happen. Yet hour by hour, moisture declines. The surface firms. Flavour deepens. The food becomes less welcoming to many forms of spoilage. You return to the hearth and reach toward a strip that has been hanging for some time. It feels dry at the edges. The centre still gives slightly beneath your fingers. not ready. You leave it where it is. Judgment remains essential. There is no temperature display, no alarm, no machine announcing completion. Your senses are the instrument: sight, smell, touch, experience. You notice whether the fire has been steady. You judge whether the food has lost enough moisture. You recognize the aroma of healthy smoke and the warning smell of something scorching. Knowledge accumulates one batch at a time. Mistakes teach too. A piece placed too close burns. Another left in a damp corner spoils. Another acquires a bitter taste from unsuitable fuel. These failures become instructions without ever becoming books. Someone simply says, "Not there. Use that beam. Keep the fire smaller. Turn the fish. Add the wood slowly." Generations of correction produce something remarkably sophisticated. By night, the flames have nearly disappeared. Only coals remain, glowing red beneath grey ash. A narrow thread of smoke rises through the dark room. Above it, the hanging food barely moves. Outside, the temperature falls. Inside, warmth gathers beneath the roof. The smoke continues its patient work, touching every surface, entering every fold, carrying the scent of fire into food that may be eaten far from this night. You listen to the soft pop of a coal breaking apart. Nothing about the scene feels hurried. That is the secret of smoking. Fire, usually associated with instant transformation, is being asked to work slowly, not to burn, not to roast, just to linger. And in that lingering, ancient people turn one of humanity's oldest companions into something more than warmth. They turn smoke into time. A clay jar sits in a warm corner, apparently doing nothing. You lean closer. Tiny bubbles rise through cloudy liquid. The surface gives off a sharp, sour smell. Something inside is alive, although nobody in the household can see the organisms responsible. This is fermentation, one of the strangest bargains humans ever make with food. Instead of trying to stop every microscopic change, you encourage certain changes and hope they prevent worse ones. Milk becomes sour, grape juice becomes wine, grain becomes beer, vegetables become tangy and acidic, fish becomes a pungent paste or sauce. At first glance, this sounds dangerously close to simply allowing food to spoil. The difference is control. You create conditions that favour useful microorganisms while making life more difficult for many harmful ones. Acids appear, alcohol may develop, salt may alter which organisms thrive. The food changes in flavour, smell, texture, and sometimes nutritional value. Ancient people do not know yeast as a microscopic fungus. They do not know lactic acid bacteria by name, but they know which jar works. They know how warm the room should feel. They know how much salt to add. They know that a little liquid from yesterday's successful batch can help today's batch begin properly. Practical knowledge arrives long before scientific explanation. Imagine milk on a hot afternoon. Fresh milk is wonderfully nutritious, which unfortunately means it is also attractive to microorganisms. Without refrigeration, it does not remain sweet and fresh for long. You pour it into a skin bag, wooden container, or clay vessel. Hours pass, the milk changes, perhaps it thickens, perhaps it turns tart, perhaps curds begin separating from watery whey. To a modern shopper expecting perfectly chilled milk, this might look like disaster. To a herding community, it can be the beginning of dinner. Fermented milk products become especially useful because livestock do something extremely inconvenient. They produce milk according to biology rather than your meal schedule. When milk is abundant, you need ways to use it quickly. Fermentation gives you options. You stir the souring milk, you strain it, you save part of the curd. You may drain away moisture until the result becomes thicker. In different places, these processes eventually contribute to countless varieties of yogurt, sour milk, cultured butter, and cheese. The details vary enormously, but the principle remains familiar. Fresh milk becomes a more durable food by becoming something else. Records confirm that people have processed milk into fermented products for thousands of years, and archaeological evidence from pottery residues shows dairy use in very early farming societies. The transformation also helps some adults digest milk. Many human adults produce less lactase, the enzyme used to digest lactose, after childhood. Fermentation can reduce some of the lactose in dairy foods, making certain products easier for many people to tolerate. Nobody needs to understand genetics to notice that sour milk sits better than fresh milk for some stomachs. Your body becomes part of the experiment. Grain offers another path. You have barley, wheat, millet, rice, maize, sorghum, or another starchy crop on its own. Grain stores well when dry, but ancient cooks discover that soaking, crushing, sprouting, heating, and fermenting it can produce drinks with entirely new properties. Beer is among the famous results. You begin with grain, water enters, enzymes break complex starches into simpler sugars. Wild or cultivated yeast consume those sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. Again, nobody is discussing biochemical pathways beside the jar. They are watching foam, they are smelling the liquid, they are tasting carefully. A vessel that looked dull yesterday now seems almost restless. Bubbles gather, a yeasty aroma rises. The drink becomes mildly intoxicating. It may also be safer to keep for a time than an equivalent mixture left to random contamination, especially when acidity and alcohol develop under favourable conditions. Ancient beer is not necessarily clear, cold, and sparkling like something poured beneath modern bar lights. It can be thick, cloudy, full of sediment. Sometimes pieces of husk or grain remain suspended inside. You may drink through a straw, partly to avoid swallowing the floating debris. One curious footnote is that ancient images from Mesopotamia show people sharing large drinking vessels through long straws. There is something pleasantly familiar about the scene. Several adults gather around one container, each drinking through a tube, proving that communal beverages have been creating complicated social arrangements for a very long time. Beer is not merely recreation. It can carry calories, it can be part of wages or rations, it can appear in offerings, it can reinforce hospitality. Fermented drinks become woven into social life because preservation and pleasure often refuse to stay separate. Wine follows its own route. You crush grapes. Juice runs across your fingers, sweet and sticky. Wild yeast naturally present on fruit skins and in the environment can begin fermentation once conditions allow. The juice becomes active, foam gathers, the sweetness declines, alcohol appears. The transformation must have seemed extraordinary to early observers. You press fruit, you wait. The liquid becomes something that changes your mood. Humanity notices, very thoroughly. Wine can keep longer than fresh grape juice, especially when stored carefully. Although ancient wine remains vulnerable to oxidation, contamination, and conversion into vinegar, containers matter, seals matter, temperature matters. A clay jar filled too carelessly may turn an anticipated celebration into several litres of disappointment. Then again, disappointment can become another preservation method. If wine is exposed to certain bacteria in the presence of oxygen, alcohol can become acetic acid. You get vinegar. The sour liquid may not be what the winemaker intended, but it is useful. Acidity suppresses many spoilage organisms. Vegetables and other foods can be placed in acidic liquids. Sauces can be sharpened. Food can be flavoured and preserved at the same time. Ancient kitchens are full of these overlaps, where one transformation leads naturally into another. Nothing is wasted if you are imaginative enough. Even failed wine can find employment. Vegetable fermentation may seem calmer, but the jar beside you is still a tiny ecosystem. You pack vegetables tightly, salt is added, liquid rises or is poured in. The food stays beneath the surface. That last detail matters because exposure to air can encourage unwanted growth at the top. Below the brine, lactic acid bacteria begin consuming sugars naturally present in the vegetables. Acidity increases. The flavour becomes sour. The environment becomes increasingly hostile to many organisms that would otherwise cause decay. You taste a piece. It is crisp but transformed, sharp, salty, alive with flavour. Cabbages, turnips, cucumbers, leafy greens, roots, and many other plants can be preserved through related methods. The exact traditions differ across regions, but the logic is wonderfully portable. Add salt, control air, allow desirable fermentation, trust experience. Of course, trust is easier when experience belongs to someone else. Imagine your first attempt. The jar bubbles unexpectedly. A strange smell appears. You ask the oldest person in the household whether this is normal. They sniff once and shrug. Apparently it is. You remain unconvinced. Ancient food preparation contains many moments in which one generation calmly consumes something the younger generation suspects may be planning an assassination. Fish fermentation pushes this confidence even further. You take fish or fish parts, often combine them with salt, and allow time to perform a transformation that can become deeply aromatic. The resulting liquid, paste, or preserved fish can provide intense savoury flavour. Across different ancient societies, fermented fish products become important foods and condiments. In parts of the Mediterranean, fish sauces are traded widely. In regions of Asia, related preservation traditions develop independently in many forms. The smell can be formidable. One scandalous aside comes from ancient urban life, where large-scale fish processing must have tested the patience of anyone living downwind. Imagine opening your shutters on a warm morning and realizing that several vats of fermenting fish have reached an especially enthusiastic stage. You may admire commerce, you may admire culinary tradition, you may also close the shutters. Fermentation involves risk because the boundary between desirable and undesirable microbial activity is not always visible. Ancient people therefore rely heavily on repetition. A successful vessel becomes valuable. A familiar container may carry microorganisms from one batch to another. Utensils can become part of the microbial environment. A starter portion from an established fermentation may be added to a fresh mixture. People learn which smells mean success. They learn which colours mean trouble. They know when to discard something. Knowledge becomes highly local. The same recipe behaves differently in another climate. A vessel in a cool room develops slowly. A vessel in summer heat moves quickly. Salt concentration changes outcomes. Water quality matters. The condition of ingredients matters. Even the material of the container can influence the process. Clay is especially interesting. Unglazed pottery contains tiny pores. Liquids can evaporate through walls. Residues remain trapped in surfaces. A jar reused repeatedly may carry traces of earlier batches. You place your hand against its side and feel that it is slightly cool from evaporation. Inside, an invisible community is working. This is perhaps the strangest thing about fermentation. Your food is being prepared by creatures you do not know exist. You provide the conditions. They perform the chemistry. You receive the result. No wages are requested. The arrangement is surprisingly efficient. Arguments split among scholars over exactly when humans begin deliberately managing fermentation, rather than simply consuming foods that fermented naturally. The distinction is difficult to prove. Fruit can ferment without human intervention. Milk can sour on its own. Wet grain can begin biological changes accidentally. At what point does accident become technique? Perhaps someone notices that one batch tastes pleasant. Perhaps they intentionally repeat the conditions. Perhaps they save a little of the old mixture and add it to the new. That moment leaves no grand monument. No inscription announces that controlled fermentation has officially begun. The transition likely happens gradually, independently, and repeatedly in many places. What matters is that humans become remarkably skilled at encouraging invisible processes. You do not understand microorganisms, you understand patterns. Warmth speeds things, cold slows them, salt changes them, air matters, clean vessels matter, time matters. The result becomes predictable enough to depend upon. Fermentation also changes food socially. A jar takes time. That creates anticipation. A drink may need days or weeks. A vegetable crock must be left alone. A dairy product develops overnight. You cannot demand instant results. The household adapts to biological rhythms. There is always something beginning, something ready, something nearly ready, and something suspicious enough that everyone quietly agrees someone else should taste it first. The flavours become part of identity. One community prefers a sharper sourness, another likes more salt, another ferments fish longer, another uses different grains. Techniques pass through families until food carries memory as strongly as nutrition. You smell a ferment and know where you are. You taste one and recognize home. Preservation becomes culture because repeated necessity eventually becomes preference. The light outside fades. The bubbling jar continues beside you. Nothing dramatic happens. No flame flashes. No blade cuts. No salt crystals glitter in the sun. The transformation is almost entirely hidden. Inside the liquid, sugars disappear, acids gather, alcohol may form, textures soften or tighten. A fresh ingredient slowly becomes a food capable of lasting longer, travelling farther, or simply tasting far more interesting. You put the lid back into place. The jar does not need you for the moment. It needs time. That may be fermentation's most unusual lesson. Sometimes keeping food means working harder. Sometimes it means learning when to leave the food alone and let an invisible world do the work for you. You lower a small clay lid onto the mouth of a jar and press it firmly into place. Inside are pieces of fruit resting beneath a layer of honey. Beside it stands another vessel filled with vegetables covered by vinegar. A third holds herbs beneath olive oil. Along the wall, rows of containers wait in cool shadow, their mouths stoppered with cloth, cork, clay, wax, resin, or whatever material the household can spare. For ancient people, preservation is often a matter of creating barriers. Keep air away, keep moisture where you want it, keep insects outside, make the food too acidic, too sugary, or otherwise too difficult for common spoilage organisms to enjoy, and above all, find a container that does not leak. That last part sounds obvious until you live in a world where every jar is handmade. You run your palm over the side of one vessel. The pottery is slightly uneven. A fingerprint from the maker may still be visible in the clay. The surface feels cool and rough. This container is not just storage, it is technology. Ancient households depend heavily on pottery because a well-made vessel can protect food from dust, pests, light, and physical damage, while also allowing liquids to be stored in ways baskets cannot manage. Records confirm that pottery becomes closely connected with food storage across many ancient farming societies, especially once communities need containers for grain, oil, wine, preserved fruits, sauces, and other provisions. But pottery alone does not keep everything fresh. The contents still need help. Honey provides one of the more luxurious methods. You dip a wooden spoon into a jar and lift it slowly. Honey stretches downward in a shining thread. It is thick enough to move reluctantly. That thickness tells you something important. Honey contains a great deal of sugar and relatively little available water. Many microorganisms struggle to grow in such an environment. Ancient people know nothing of water activity. They know that honey keeps remarkably well. They also discover that certain foods placed in honey can last longer than they would in open air. Fruits can be covered. Nuts can be mixed into it. Medicinal herbs may be stored in it. In some places, cooked foods are preserved in sweet mixtures. Honey also appears in medicines and religious offerings. which gives it a status far above that of an ordinary sweetener. Obtaining it is not always pleasant. Someone has to approach bees. There is smoke, there is buzzing, there is climbing, there is the possibility that the bees strongly disagree with your harvesting plan. A jar of honey therefore represents effort, risk, and access to suitable landscapes. You probably do not pour it casually over everything in sight. It is valuable. A household with limited honey uses it carefully. Still, its keeping qualities are extraordinary. A curious footnote is that archaeologists have recovered very old honey from sealed ancient contexts that remained recognizable after enormous stretches of time. That does not mean every ancient jar of honey survives perfectly forever. Moisture can enter. Fermentation can occur if the honey is diluted. Containers can fail. But properly stored honey is remarkably stable. This makes it one of nature's more convenient preservation substances. Sugar itself performs a related role when concentrated enough. In regions and periods where concentrated syrups or fruit reductions are available, people can cook fruits down into thick mixtures. Water evaporates. Sugars become concentrated. The texture changes from juicy to sticky. You begin with a basket of fruit that bruises easily. Hours later, you may have something dark, sweet, dense, and far easier to store. The kitchen smells almost overwhelming during the process. Fruit sugars caramelize slightly around the edges of a pot. Steam rises, your hands become sticky. Flies appear with astonishing punctuality. You wave them away. Preservation has once again attracted precisely the creatures it is supposed to defeat. Vinegar creates a very different environment. Instead of overwhelming microorganisms with sugar, you confront them with acid. You lift the lid from a jar and immediately feel the sharp scent in your nose. There is no mistaking vinegar. It wakes the senses. Acetic acid creates conditions that many spoilage organisms find difficult. Vegetables, fruits, herbs, and sometimes animal foods can be submerged in acidic liquid to extend their usefulness. The method depends on sufficient acidity, proper preparation, and a vessel that keeps the contents covered. Ancient households may obtain vinegar as a natural consequence of wine or other alcoholic drinks turning sour. A batch that fails as a beverage can therefore become useful in the kitchen. That is a pleasingly practical kind of failure. You wanted wine. You received vinegar. Dinner adjusts. Vegetables placed in vinegar acquire a flavour that is bright and sharp. Some soften. Some remain pleasantly firm. Herbs contribute additional aromas. Spices, where available, can change the result completely. Preservation becomes seasoning. A household may develop favourite combinations, not because anyone is writing recipes for future publication, but because repeated success turns into habit. The jar becomes recognisable by smell alone. You know which one contains onions. You know which one contains herbs. You know which one was made too strong and causes everyone at the table to blink after the first bite. Vinegar is useful partly because acidity changes the microbial environment quickly. Yet ancient people still depend on experience. They judge the liquid. They judge the food. They know that pieces rising above the surface may deteriorate faster, so weights can be used to keep contents submerged. A clean stone may do the job. A ceramic disc may fit inside the jar. Leaves or cloth can help hold smaller pieces down. The principle is humble, but important. What stays beneath the preserving liquid is often safer than what floats exposed to air. Oil creates another kind of barrier. You pour olive oil over herbs or cooked vegetables. The golden surface settles. Light reflects from it in a smooth sheet. Beneath, the food disappears. Oil limits contact with air and can help protect certain prepared foods when used correctly and combined with other preservation conditions. Ancient Mediterranean households are especially familiar with olive oil, which is used for cooking, lighting, cosmetics, ritual, medicine, and storage. Few substances work harder. An olive grove may therefore support far more than meals. The fruit is harvested, olives are crushed, paste is pressed, liquid separates, oil is collected, the work is messy, your hands smell grassy and bitter, the press creaks, stone surfaces become slick. Eventually, the oil is poured into containers and allowed to settle. Some of it will be eaten, some burned in lamps, some rubbed onto skin, some used to cover or prepare food. It is difficult to imagine a modern pantry ingredient with such a broad ancient career. Oil, however, is not a perfect shield. Food trapped beneath oil can still spoil if conditions are wrong. Modern food safety knowledge makes clear that excluding air alone is not enough to make every food safe. Ancient people do not know the microorganisms involved, but generations of practice teach them which combinations tend to work. Often oil is used with salt, acidity, cooking, drying, or other preparation. Once again, successful preservation is less about a single magical ingredient than about stacking advantages. A cooked vegetable placed beneath seasoned oil behaves differently from a raw, wet vegetable thrown carelessly into a jar. The household learns the difference. Containers become central to all of these methods. You walk into a storeroom and realize that pottery comes in many shapes, because food comes in many forms. Wide mouths allow easy access. Narrow necks reduce exposure. Large jars hold bulk goods. Small containers protect expensive ingredients. Handles allow carrying. Pointed bases may fit into racks or soft ground during transport. A jar is designed around its job. Sealing is equally important. A cloth cover may keep out insects, but not air. A stopper can close a narrow neck. Clay can be pressed over an opening. Wax may improve a seal. Resin can coat surfaces or help close gaps. Sometimes the inside of a porous pottery vessel is treated to reduce leakage. The scent of resin can cling to whatever is stored within. Wine, oil, sauces, and preserved foods therefore acquire subtle flavours from their containers. One scandalous aside is that ancient diners may become so accustomed to these tastes that what you consider an intrusive flavour of resin or smoke might simply register to them as normal. Your idea of pure flavour is shaped by glass bottles, stainless steel, plastic liners, and refrigeration. Their food lives beside clay, wood, leather, wax, smoke, and resin. The container becomes part of the taste. Transport makes sealing even more important. Imagine loading jars onto a merchant ship. The deck moves, ropes tighten, ceramic containers knock against one another. If a stopper fails, valuable oil leaks. If a vessel cracks, wine disappears into the hold. If seawater enters, the cargo changes in ways nobody requested. So jars are packed carefully. Some are wedged into racks. Others are cushioned with plant material. Amphorae with narrow necks and handles become especially useful across Mediterranean trade because they can be carried, stacked, and sealed. They may hold wine, oil, fish sauce, preserved fruits, and other goods. A harbour filled with these vessels looks almost like a forest of clay. Dockworkers lift them. Merchants inspect markings. Officials calculate quantities. Food preservation has become logistics again. The vessel lets food move beyond the kitchen. A jar sealed in one town may be opened hundreds of miles away. Its contents carry the smell of another landscape. Olive oil from one region, wine from another, fruit preserved in syrup, fish products from a distant coast. A household can taste geography. Scholars still argue whether particular residues found inside some ancient vessels always reveal their original contents, or whether repeated reuse complicates the picture. The problem is understandable. A jar may have a long life. It could hold oil 1 year, grain the next, and something entirely different later. Residues seep into porous surfaces. Labels disappear. Containers are repaired and repurposed. Archaeologists can identify many substances through chemical analysis, but interpreting every vessel remains complicated. For the ancient owner, reuse is simply sensible. A good jar is valuable. You do not throw it away because its first purpose has ended. You wash it, you dry it, you patch a small crack, you use it again. If the jar once held something strongly scented, perhaps everyone quietly accepts that tonight's meal will inherit a faint memory of last year's contents. Storage rooms therefore become collections of objects with histories: a patched vessel, a lid that fits only one particular mouth, a jar reserved for honey, a smaller pot used for sour liquids, a container nobody trusts because it leaks from somewhere near the base. You know them the way modern people know temperamental appliances. Do not use that one for oil. Turn this lid slightly. Keep this jar in the coolest corner. Household technology always develops personality. As night settles, you check the vessels one by one. A wax seal feels firm under your thumb. A cloth cover is tied tightly. Oil lies smooth over herbs. Vinegar carries its sharp smell even through a narrow opening. Honey catches the lamplight and glows amber. The jars seem still, but each one creates a small protected world. Inside, food is separated from some of the dangers surrounding it. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to matter. You extinguish the lamp. Its flame shrinks, flickers, and vanishes. For a moment, the scent of warm oil hangs in the darkness against the wall. The jars remain silent, holding sweetness, acidity, fat, fruit, herbs, and carefully guarded meals behind layers of clay. The ancient pantry does not need electricity to feel ingenious. Sometimes all it needs is the right liquid, a good seal, and a jar you have finally learned not to drop. You pull open a heavy wooden door and feel cold air slide across your hands. Outside, the afternoon is warm. Inside, the temperature drops almost immediately. The floor lies below ground level. Stone walls hold the chill. The air smells of damp earth, old wood, roots, and the faint mineral scent of clay. This is refrigeration without a refrigerator. Ancient people learn very early that the earth changes temperature more slowly than the air above it. Summer heat may scorch a courtyard, yet a shaded underground room remains noticeably cooler. Winter cold may freeze the surface, while deeper soil stays comparatively stable. That difference can be used. You descend another step. The light weakens. Shelves appear along the walls, holding jars, baskets, roots, perhaps fruit wrapped in straw. Nothing here is frozen. That is important. The goal is often not to turn food into ice, but to slow the processes that make it deteriorate. Cool temperatures generally reduce the speed of microbial growth and chemical change. Fruit softens more slowly. Dairy products may remain useful longer. Some vegetables keep their texture. Meat can gain precious extra time. Ancient people need no thermometer to notice this. They simply know that the cool room is kinder to food. Records confirm that underground storage spaces, pits, caves, cellars, and naturally cool chambers are used across many ancient societies to protect provisions from heat and rapid temperature changes. The design varies according to landscape. In one region, people dig storage pits directly into dry soil. In another, they use natural caves. Elsewhere, stone cellars are built beneath houses. A wealthy estate may have a purpose-built underground chamber. A village household may have nothing more elaborate than a carefully lined hole in the ground. The principle remains similar. Go downward, escape the sun. Use the earth as insulation. You crouch beside a storage pit. Its opening is narrower than the cavity below. That shape helps limit exposure to warm air. The sides may be lined with clay, straw, stone, wood, or plaster depending on local materials. Food goes inside, then the opening is covered. Perhaps a flat stone fits across it. Perhaps packed earth forms part of the seal. Perhaps woven material is placed beneath a lid to reduce dust and insects. The interior becomes a little world with a more stable temperature than the landscape above. Grain can be stored this way under suitable dry conditions. Roots and tubers can also benefit from cool darkness. Apples, pomegranates, onions, garlic, and other durable produce may survive longer when protected from heat and direct sun. But underground storage creates its own dangers. Cool is useful. Damp can be disastrous. You touch the wall. Moisture gathers faintly against your fingertips. If water enters the pit, grain may mould, roots may rot, wood may swell, insects may find shelter. The same earth that protects food from heat can destroy it if drainage is poor. So location matters. You do not dig in the lowest place simply because it is convenient. You watch where rainwater flows. You notice which soil stays dry. You learn whether groundwater rises during wet months. The landscape must be read carefully. A pit on a slight slope may drain better. A raised entrance may keep surface water out. Stone lining may reduce soil contact. Dry straw can absorb small amounts of moisture, though it too must be watched. Ancient cold storage is therefore less like opening a refrigerator door and more like negotiating constantly with geology. Caves offer another possibility. Step inside one and the sensation is immediate. The bright outside world disappears. Sound changes. Your footsteps become hollow. Stone feels cold against your palm. In many climates, cave interiors remain much more stable in temperature than open air. That makes them useful for storing foods that dislike heat. Yet caves are not automatically perfect pantries. Animals may live there. Water may drip from ceilings. Airflow may be poor. Carrying heavy jars through narrow passages is unpleasant. And there is always the small issue of darkness. You enter carrying an oil lamp. Its flame flickers. Every shadow becomes larger than necessary. A perfectly practical storage chamber can suddenly feel like the sort of place where your imagination begins inventing creatures that archaeology has never confirmed. Still, the cooling effect is valuable. Then winter arrives, and cold becomes more powerful. In regions with reliable snow and ice, people can collect winter itself and attempt to keep part of it alive through warmer months. That sounds almost impossible until you understand insulation. Ice does not need magic to survive summer. It needs protection from heat. You cut blocks from frozen water or gather compacted snow. The material is carried to a deep pit, chamber, or specially constructed ice house. Layers of straw, reeds, sawdust, earth, or other insulating material may be packed around it. The entrance is closed tightly. Drainage allows meltwater to escape. Slowly, very slowly, the ice shrinks. But if the chamber is well designed and large enough, some can remain for months. The larger the mass of ice, the more slowly it warms compared with small, scattered pieces. A few cubes vanish quickly. A deep chamber packed with winter ice behaves very differently. You descend towards such a space and feel the air become startlingly cold. Your breath may become visible. The floor is slick. Straw sticks to damp surfaces. In the dimness, blocks of ice glimmer faintly beneath layers of insulation. Outside, perhaps insects buzz in summer heat. Inside, winter waits underground. Ancient elites in several civilizations make use of stored snow or ice, sometimes for cooling drinks and foods, sometimes for luxury consumption, and sometimes for broader household storage. Access, however, is unequal. A labourer does not casually decide to construct an enormous ice house after supper. Collecting ice requires workers. Transport requires time. A large insulated chamber requires materials and planning. If snow comes from mountains, moving it can be expensive. Cold becomes a form of status. The wealthy may enjoy chilled drinks when everyone else is sweating. There is something almost comically modern about this. The ability to complain that your beverage is not cold enough turns out to have a very respectable history. One curious footnote is that rulers in some hot regions arrange for snow to be transported from mountains over considerable distances. Imagine that journey. Men or animals carry tightly packed snow through warmer terrain. The load begins melting immediately. Every delay costs part of the cargo. Shade becomes important. Travel may happen at night or during cooler hours. Insulating materials help reduce loss. By the time the snow arrives, what remains is valuable precisely because most people cannot obtain it easily. It may cool fruit, it may chill wine or water, it may become part of fashionable desserts in later traditions. A cold mouthful in summer becomes a display of wealth, yet ordinary households have cleverer, cheaper cooling tricks. Evaporation can lower temperature. You fill a porous clay vessel with water, tiny amounts seep toward the outer surface and evaporate. That evaporation removes heat. The water inside becomes cooler than the surrounding air under favourable dry conditions. Now place food near such vessels, or use nested pots with damp material between them, and you can create a modest cooling effect. The principle works best in hot, dry climates where evaporation happens readily. You touch the outside of the pot. It feels damp. Then you touch the water inside. Cooler, not icy, not miraculous, but noticeably different, so a few degrees can matter. A shaded, breezy corner improves the effect. The ancient household does not need to recreate a modern refrigerator. It only needs to slow the clock. Water itself can also provide cool storage. A sealed container may be lowered into a well or placed in cool flowing water. Springs can remain cold even during warm weather. A jar suspended above the waterline inside a deep well benefits from cooler air. If the vessel can be kept dry and secure, the well becomes a natural cooling shaft. You lower a small container by rope. The fibres rub against your palm. Below, you hear the faint splash of water. The jar disappears into darkness. Hours later, when it returns, the surface feels cool. This method is simple, but it requires a reliable water source and careful protection from contamination. You do not want your dairy jar falling into the drinking well. Nobody enjoys explaining that accident to the entire household. Cold storage becomes especially useful for foods that are difficult to preserve by aggressive methods. Fresh fruit may lose much of its character if dried. Some dairy foods are better when simply kept cool for a short period. Cooked dishes may need temporary protection between meals. Freshly slaughtered meat can benefit from cold conditions while other processing is prepared. Cool spaces provide flexibility. They give you time to decide. That is their great advantage. Drying transforms food strongly. Smoking transforms it. Fermentation transforms it. Cold can preserve something closer to its original state, at least briefly. An apple remains an apple. A jar of milk remains milk for longer. A piece of meat stays comparatively fresh rather than immediately becoming cured meat. The effect is temporary, but temporary can be enough. Temperature control also shapes seasonal planning. You pay attention to winter not only as a difficult season but as an opportunity. Cold weather makes slaughter easier in many places because meat can be processed without the intense pressure of summer heat. Frozen ground may allow temporary storage. Snow can cover containers. Ice can preserve fish. A household may deliberately schedule certain food work around the coldest months. Nature becomes a calendar. You do not ask what the temperature forecast says. You feel the frost. You notice ice forming on water. You listen to older people declare that the proper cold has finally arrived. Work begins. Fish may be laid out to freeze naturally. Meat can hang in cold air. Containers move into protected sheds. The season itself joins the preservation process. Freezing is particularly powerful where winters remain reliably cold. When water inside food freezes, many biological processes slow drastically. Microbial growth largely stops while the food remains frozen, though texture can change and spoilage resumes after thawing. Ancient people learn this through experience. Frozen meat keeps. Thawed meat must be used. Repeated warming and freezing can damage quality. No scientific explanation is needed. You only need one unfortunate thaw to remember the lesson. Scholars still argue whether some prehistoric cold climate communities intentionally created specialized freezing caches, or simply took advantage of naturally frozen conditions as circumstances allowed. The archaeological evidence can be difficult to separate. A pit containing animal remains might represent storage. It might represent refuse. It might have served several purposes at different times. Frozen organic material rarely survives in ordinary sites long enough to explain exactly how people managed it. Yet in permafrost regions and exceptional cold environments, preservation can be astonishing. Hair, skin, plant material, and food remains may survive for centuries or millennia. Cold becomes not merely a household tool, but an accidental archivist. You see this most dramatically where ice protects things no ancient person ever intended to preserve for distant observers. A meal, a tool, a scrap of clothing, or the remains of an animal can persist because low temperatures slow decay for an extraordinary length of time. Cold does not care whether something is historically important, it simply slows change. The wealthy attempt to control that power deliberately. Some ancient ice storage facilities become engineering achievements. Deep chambers may be partly underground. Thick walls reduce heat transfer. A domed structure limits warm air. Ventilation is controlled. Meltwater drains away so liquid water does not accelerate further melting. You stand inside such a building and realize that architecture itself is acting like a thermal barrier. Every choice has a purpose. Thickness, depth, shade, airflow, drainage, insulation. There is no compressor, no coolant, no electricity, only geometry and an understanding of heat learned through repeated practice. One scandalous aside is that chilled luxuries can provoke moral criticism. Writers in various societies complain about elites becoming too fond of elaborate comforts, and cold drinks can become symbols of unnecessary refinement. Apparently, even in antiquity, there is always someone ready to announce that civilization is collapsing, because wealthy young people prefer their beverages served too cold. The complaint survives more reliably than the ice. You return to the cellar as evening settles outside. The temperature here barely seems to notice. The walls remain cool. A basket of roots sits in one corner. Jars stand on shelves. The air carries no smoke, no sharp vinegar, no strong fermentation, only earth, stone, wood, a little dampness. The quiet feels different from a kitchen. This is not a place of active transformation. It is a place of delay. You press your hand against the wall once more. Cold enters your palm slowly. Above you, summer air may still hold the day's heat. Down here, the earth refuses to hurry. That refusal is useful. Food lasts because the environment moves at a slower rhythm. Fruit ripens reluctantly. Milk sours more slowly. Roots remain firm. Ice hidden beneath straw gives up winter one drop at a time. The ancient world cannot command cold with the turn of a dial, but it can find cold, trap it, borrow it, bury food beside it, and persuade the earth to hold on to it for just a little longer. You push open the door of a grain store and step into air that feels dry, dusty, and faintly sweet. Sacks lean against one wall. Large clay bins rise from the floor. Loose kernels sit behind plastered partitions. Somewhere above you, a beam creaks. Then comes the sound nobody wants to hear. A tiny scratching. You stop. The scratching stops too. For several seconds, you and whatever is hiding in the wall appear to reach a mutual agreement not to acknowledge one another. Then it begins again. Grain storage is a battle against very small enemies. Mice, rats, beetles, weevils, moths, mould, moisture, and occasionally your own unfortunate decision to store an entire harvest before it has dried properly. For farming communities, grain is among the most important foods to preserve because it can remain edible for a long time under good conditions. wheat, barley, millet, rice, sorghum, maize, and other grains naturally store better than fresh meat or fruit because their moisture content can be reduced quite low. But that does not mean you simply throw grain into a pile and congratulate yourself. A pile creates its own environment. Warmth can build inside. Moisture can become trapped. Insects can reproduce unseen. Rodents can burrow into the edges. The larger the store, the more carefully it must be managed. You scoop up a handful of kernels and let them fall slowly through your fingers. They should feel hard, dry, clean. A little dust is normal. A sour or musty smell is not. Records confirm that large granaries appear in many ancient civilizations, from the Near East and Egypt to South Asia, East Asia, the Mediterranean, Africa, and the Americas. Their designs differ, but they share a simple purpose. Keep the harvest usable until it is needed. Some granaries are household-sized, others are enormous. A state, temple, palace, estate, or town can collect grain on a scale that turns storage into engineering. You walk around one such building and immediately notice that its floor does not sit directly on damp soil. It may be raised. Stone footings support wooden beams. Air can pass underneath. The arrangement helps reduce moisture and makes it more difficult for rodents to reach the stored food. More difficult does not mean impossible. Rodents regard human engineering as a personal challenge. A mouse can squeeze through openings that seem absurdly small. A rat can climb rough surfaces. Both are excellent at turning your expensive granary into a private restaurant. So ancient builders experiment. They smooth walls. They raise storage structures on posts. They use stone discs or wide barriers around supports in some traditions, creating obstacles that climbing animals struggle to pass. They close gaps. They inspect corners. The design of a granary becomes part architecture, part pest defense. You run your hand along a plastered wall. It feels surprisingly smooth. That smoothness matters. Cracks offer hiding places. Rough surfaces give insects and rodents access. A carefully finished interior is easier to inspect and clean. If grain is stored in separate compartments, a problem in one section may be contained before it spreads everywhere. That is a comforting thought when your entire winter diet is sitting inside. Ventilation matters too. Freshly harvested grain may still contain enough moisture to cause trouble. Airflow allows heat and dampness to escape. Some storage buildings use openings positioned to encourage circulation. Others depend on dry climate and thick walls. The exact solution changes with environment. In a hot, dry region, ventilation may help greatly. In a humid region, outside air can bring moisture with it. You do not want more airflow simply because airflow sounds healthy. You want the right airflow. The ancient storekeeper learns this the same way sailors learn wind. By watching, by smelling, by touching, by remembering which season caused problems last year. Grain can also be stored underground in pits, especially where soil conditions are suitable. At first this seems risky. You're placing food inside the earth, a place famous for containing dampness, insects, roots, and creatures with teeth. But a well-prepared underground silo can work remarkably well. The pit is dried, its walls may be lined. Grain is poured inside. The opening is sealed. Once the oxygen within is reduced through biological activity, insect activity can slow considerably. The sealed environment becomes surprisingly protective if moisture stays low. You uncover such a pit carefully. A cap of earth and clay gives way. Cool air rises. Below, grain rests in darkness. The method can preserve large quantities without requiring a huge building above ground. It also hides the store. That can be useful in troubled times. A visible granary announces wealth. An underground cache announces nothing. Invaders, thieves, tax collectors, and hungry neighbours cannot steal what they cannot find. A curious footnote is that some communities deliberately conceal grain pits around settlements or in fields, creating hidden reserves known only to particular families. You imagine trying to remember exactly where you buried 3 months of food, the large tree, the unusual rock, 12 paces from the old wall, unless someone cuts down the tree, moves the rock, or your uncle confidently remembers the wrong field. Preservation occasionally depends on excellent memory. Above ground, granaries can become much more public. A large storehouse is a statement. It says abundance, it says planning, it says authority. It also says somebody is keeping records. Once grain is collected from hundreds or thousands of farmers, administrators need to know how much enters, how much leaves, and who is entitled to receive it. Clay tablets, seals, tally systems, written accounts, measuring vessels, and standardized weights become part of grain management in many societies. You arrive with a basket. An official measures it. Another person records something. The grain disappears into a storage compartment. Perhaps it is tax, perhaps rent, perhaps an offering, perhaps repayment. The process is practical, but it is also political. A ruler who controls food reserves possesses leverage. During a shortage, stored grain can be distributed. During construction projects, workers can be fed from central stores. Military forces can receive rations. Officials can be paid partly in food. A granary therefore stores more than calories. It stores administrative power. You stand in the doorway of a large complex and watch workers carrying baskets in steady lines. Dust rises from their feet. Wooden measures knock against one another. Someone calls out quantities. A scribe bends over a writing surface. The scene is not glamorous. No golden crown is required, but this is one of the quiet mechanisms that allows large societies to function. Food enters, records grow. Food leaves, obligations are created, control becomes visible one basket at a time. Historians still argue whether centralized grain storage creates political hierarchy, or whether political hierarchy simply makes large-scale storage easier to organize. The answer is probably different in different places. Some communities manage shared stores cooperatively. Others place them under elite control. Some rulers advertise their ability to distribute food during hardship. Others may use access to stores as a way to demand loyalty. A granary can be a safety net. It can also be a treasury. Sometimes it is both. The physical problem of keeping the grain edible remains stubbornly ordinary. Insects are especially difficult. A single adult beetle is easy to ignore. Hundreds hidden inside grain are not. Some species lay eggs in or near kernels. Larvae feed where you cannot easily see them. By the time obvious damage appears, the infestation may already be extensive. Ancient households therefore develop ways to discourage pests. Grain may be cleaned carefully before storage. Dust and broken kernels are removed because they can encourage insects. Ash may be mixed with grain in some traditional systems. Certain aromatic plants or leaves may be added. Smoke may be used around storage spaces. Containers may be sealed tightly. Cats become extremely valuable employees. The cat, of course, does not consider itself an employee, considers the granary a comfortable hunting estate provided for its personal satisfaction. That arrangement suits everyone well enough. You watch one slip between two jars. Its paws make almost no sound. A moment later, the scratching in the wall stops. This may be one of the most elegant forms of pest control ever developed. No complicated mechanism. Just a predator with excellent hearing and an attitude problem. Rodents cause more than direct food loss. They contaminate stores with droppings and urine. They chew baskets. They damage wooden structures. They open pathways that insects and moisture can exploit. So a granary must be inspected continuously. You look near the base of a wall. A few grains lie scattered. That could mean careless handling. It could also mean something has been eating. You find a small hole. Now the evening has acquired a new task. Ancient preservation rarely allows you the luxury of assuming everything is fine. You check. Then you check again. Fire presents another danger. Dry grain burns extremely well. So do wooden floors, baskets, roofing materials, and straw. A granary full of food can become an enormous fuel source. Lamps and open flames must be handled carefully. The very dryness that protects grain from mould makes the building vulnerable to fire. You enter with a small lamp held away from loose straw. No one wants a heroic story about accidentally destroying an entire year's harvest. Heroism is less useful than caution. The placement of granaries can reflect this risk. Some stand apart from houses, others are built within guarded compounds. In towns where fire can spread rapidly between wooden roofs, separating major food stores offers obvious advantages, yet distance creates another problem. Security. A granary away from homes may be easier for thieves to approach unnoticed. So guards, walls, locks, seals, or watchful neighbours become part of preservation too. A storage method can begin with biology and end with criminal prevention. Then there is measurement. You need to know how much food remains. At harvest, a full granary feels reassuringly infinite. Months later, the level has dropped. You calculate. How many people are eating? How much seed must be saved for planting? How much can be traded? How much must remain untouched in case the next harvest fails? Seed grain is especially important. Eat all of it during hunger, and you survive the present by damaging the future. Do not eat enough, and the present may become unbearable. The decision can be brutal. A storage bin is therefore full of choices as much as grain. Some kernels are meals, some are wages, some are taxes, some are next year's fields. They look identical in your hand. Their purposes are completely different. You pour grain into a measuring basket and level the top with your palm. The sound is soft and continuous. Thousands of kernels fall together like dry rain. There is something calming about it. Each grain is small. Together, they become security. Enough grain supports a household, more supports a village, far more supports a city. The scale changes, but the principle remains intimate. Someone must keep it dry. Someone must keep pests out. Someone must notice when the smell changes. Someone must resist opening the stores too early. One scandalous aside is that official granaries can become perfect targets for corruption. A measure can be dishonest. Records can be altered. Good grain can be exchanged for poor grain. Officials can skim a little from every delivery. Nothing about bureaucracy prevents people from discovering creative ways to steal lunch. That makes seals important. A container or door may be closed with clay bearing an official impression. If the seal is broken, someone has opened it. The method is simple but effective. You inspect the small lump of hardened clay at a doorway. The mark remains intact. For now, at least. The grain belongs to whoever the record says it belongs to. By late afternoon, warm light enters through a high opening and catches dust drifting in the air. The granary feels almost peaceful. Bins stand full. Jars remain sealed. The cat is asleep now, apparently satisfied with its contribution to agricultural civilization. You kneel beside a compartment and push your hand into the grain. Cool kernels slide around your wrist. Dry, firm. No strange warmth, no sour smell, no visible insects. That is success. Not spectacular success. Nothing flashes or shines. The grain simply remains grain. And that ordinary result may be the entire point. A harvest gathered months ago still waits. Seeds still hold future fields inside them. Meals still exist in potential. The building around you is quiet, but it contains patience measured in thousands upon thousands of kernels. You withdraw your hand and smooth the surface. The grain settles, the sound fades. For another night, the store remains closed, guarded by plaster, timber, careful design, watchful eyes, and one sleeping cat who will undoubtedly claim full credit. You enter the market early because early matters. The sun has only begun warming the street, but sellers are already calling out prices. Baskets crowd the ground. Fish lie on damp mats. Greens still carry droplets from washing. Cheese sits beneath cloth. Fruit is stacked carefully, with the bruised pieces turned where buyers are less likely to notice. You have no refrigerator waiting at home. That changes the meaning of shopping. You're not filling a cart for the entire week. In many ancient towns and cities, especially where households have limited storage, you buy what can be eaten reasonably soon. Fresh food moves quickly from cellar to kitchen. The market therefore has its own daily rhythm. Some goods arrive before sunrise. Others appear only on certain days. Fish may come in while the catch is still recent. Bread is baked repeatedly. Milk must be sold or processed quickly. Vegetables are carried in from nearby gardens. You learn when to arrive because timing affects quality. A household servant sent too late may return with whatever everyone else rejected. That is not an ideal way to impress the person controlling the kitchen. You move toward a fish stall. There is no printed label stating when the fish was caught. No refrigerated display. No thermometer. You lean closer. The eyes matter. The smell matters. The firmness of the flesh matters. The appearance of the gills may matter. You press lightly with a finger and watch whether the flesh springs back. The vendor notices you checking. Of course the vendor notices. Now a quiet contest begins. The seller wants you to believe this fish practically leapt from the water directly into the basket 5 minutes ago. You would like evidence. Neither of you possesses a barcode scanner, so freshness becomes a social negotiation. Records confirm that ancient urban markets were often regulated through rules involving weights, measures, prices, locations, and acceptable trading practices. Authorities care because food markets affect public order. Bad measures anger buyers. Short supplies create tension. Spoiled food can create illness. Dishonest sellers damage trust. Officials may inspect stalls, enforce standard measures, or restrict where certain products can be sold. The exact rules vary between societies, but markets are rarely completely carefree. Food is too important. You pick up an onion. Its outer skin is dry. Good. You turn a pear in your palm. Soft near one side. Maybe too soft. You smell a bunch of herbs. Still fragrant. Useful. Your senses do the work modern packaging often does for you. You become good at reading tiny clues. A glossy surface might mean freshness in one food and suspicious treatment in another. A sour scent could be welcome in fermented food and alarming in milk that was supposed to be sweet. A little mold on one product might be normal. On another, it means walk away. There is no single rule called freshness. You need knowledge specific to each ingredient. That knowledge begins young. Children accompanying adults to market watch fingers squeeze fruit. They hear arguments over fish. They learn which cheese should smell sharp and which smell means trouble. They notice that a good melon sounds different when tapped. They learn that a seller who talks too quickly may deserve additional inspection. Market education is not formal, but it is relentless. At home, the same attention continues. A fresh ingredient is rarely placed somewhere and forgotten. It is assigned a future. Tonight, tomorrow morning, for guests, for the workers, for a child, for the pot already warming over the fire. If something is fragile, you use it first. If something will keep, you save it. Household food management is largely a ranking of urgency. Leafy greens are impatient. Roots are calmer. Fresh fish is demanding. Hard cheese can wait. A melon quietly insists that you make a decision before it makes one for you. This creates a style of cooking built around constant assessment. You open a basket and look at what needs attention, which fruit has softened, which bread is becoming dry, what can be reheated, what can be added to a stew, what should be given away rather than risk losing it. Leftovers do exist, but they are managed differently from a modern plastic container, forgotten behind a bottle of sauce for 12 days. Cooked food may be eaten again later the same day. It may be kept covered overnight in cooler weather. It may be reheated thoroughly. It may be combined with new ingredients. Stale bread can become porridge, soup thickener, crumbs, or another cooked preparation. Bones and scraps can flavour broth. Wilted herbs can enter sauces. Very ripe fruit can be cooked. Nothing about this requires romanticising poverty. It is simply practical. Food costs labour. Throwing it away casually makes little sense. One curious footnote is that stale bread can become desirable in certain dishes precisely because its dryness allows it to absorb liquids better than fresh bread. Yesterday's loaf may therefore be inferior for breakfast but excellent for supper. Your kitchen does not divide food neatly into fresh and useless. There are stages. Newly baked, a little dry, quite dry, perfect for soaking, too far gone. Good cooks understand the transitions. That understanding reduces waste. Sharing becomes another preservation strategy, though nobody necessarily calls it that. Suppose you have more ripe figs than your household can eat. You could watch them soften into waste, or you could send some next door. Tomorrow the neighbour may send you beans, bread, or part of a cooked dish. Food circulates through relationships. A surplus becomes an obligation. An obligation becomes social security. You're not preserving the figs physically. You're preserving their value. The exchange matters especially where household production varies. One family has extra milk today. Another has vegetables. Someone has slaughtered an animal. Someone else baked more bread than needed. Sharing allows perishable food to move quickly toward mouths. There is practical wisdom in generosity. Of course, generosity can come with memory. People remember who shares. They also remember who always appears when meat is cooking and somehow vanishes when everyone else needs help bringing in grain. Ancient neighbourhoods contain all the familiar personalities: the cheerful giver, the careful accountant, the relative who arrives at exactly the right moment, the neighbour who insists they are only passing by while staring directly into your cooking pot. Social life helps determine where food goes. Class matters too. A wealthy household can command servants, larger storage areas, imported goods, and frequent deliveries. A poor household may buy in tiny quantities because there is little money or space to do otherwise. Buying small amounts can keep food relatively fresh, but it also creates vulnerability. If prices rise tomorrow, you have little buffer. If the market closes, you have a problem. If wages do not arrive, dinner changes immediately. Food anxiety is therefore not always about spoilage. It is about access. You walk through the market near midday and notice prices shifting. A basket of grain costs more than last month. Why, perhaps harvests were poor. Perhaps transport was interrupted. Perhaps merchants are holding stock. Perhaps rumours of shortage have encouraged panic buying. Food markets react quickly to uncertainty. A city that consumes more than its surrounding countryside can become especially dependent on constant supply. Ships, carts, pack animals, river boats, and human porters bring food inward every day. Disrupt those flows, and the effects can be immediate. This is one reason governments become deeply interested in staple foods. Rome offers a famous example. The city eventually depends heavily on imported grain, and authorities organize large systems of supply and distribution to reduce the risk of urban shortage. Grain from distant provinces can feed a population far larger than nearby farms alone could reliably support. That is a mainstream historical fact with enormous consequences. A city can grow beyond its local food landscape only if transport and supply remain dependable. But fresh foods create a harder challenge. You cannot send every ingredient across an empire. Many products must remain regional or seasonal. That makes ancient diets more visibly tied to the calendar. You know when particular fruits appear. You expect certain vegetables in certain months. Fresh abundance arrives in waves. Then it disappears. The market itself changes colour through the year. Spring offers tender greens. Summer crowds stalls with fruit. Autumn brings harvest abundance. Winter narrows the range. Seasonality is not a lifestyle choice. It is simply how food works. You become excited by the first appearance of something because you have not been eating an imported version of it every week for the previous 6 months. The first figs matter. The first grapes matter. The first fresh greens after a lean season matter. Absence creates anticipation. That anticipation shapes festivals, recipes, and memories. Market food also carries risks that are difficult to judge. A cellar may disguise age. Water may be sprinkled over wilted vegetables. Poor wine may be mixed with better wine. Weights may be manipulated. Inferior grain can be hidden beneath a good top layer. One scandalous aside is that complaints about dishonest food sellers are almost as old as written urban life. Human beings create markets, and almost immediately someone decides the official measure would be improved if it were slightly smaller. Buyers respond with suspicion. You watch the scale. You inspect the weight. You count coins twice. You choose sellers whose reputations you know. Trust becomes valuable. A merchant who repeatedly provides good food gains customers. A customer who pays reliably gets better treatment. Personal relationships partly compensate for the absence of modern certification. You know the baker, you know the vegetable seller, you know whose milk tends to arrive fresh. Reputation acts as quality control. Not perfectly, but significantly. Households also learn to cook with uncertainty. A recipe cannot always demand exact ingredients. If the market has no fresh leeks, you use onions. If the fish looks poor, you buy lentils. If fruit is expensive, dessert becomes something else. Flexibility is essential. Ancient cooking is shaped less by rigid written recipes than by available ingredients, household habits, and the judgment of the cook. Scholars bicker for how much surviving elite literature reflects the meals of ordinary people. Luxurious recipes and banquet descriptions survive because wealthy writers leave more records. Daily household cooking leaves far less written evidence. The quiet meal of grain porridge, bread, legumes, onions, greens, or small amounts of fish rarely earns a grand description. So, historians piece everyday diets together from archaeological remains, household equipment, bones, seeds, residues, accounts, and scattered comments. The ordinary kitchen must often be reconstructed from fragments. You do not think of your meal as historical evidence. You are simply hungry. You buy a small loaf. It is warm enough that you smell it through the cloth. The crust crackles when pressed. Nearby, a seller pours lentils into a measure. A woman examines garlic. Someone argues loudly about the price of oil. A child tries to touch a pile of peaches and receives a quick correction. The market feels alive because food never stops moving. From field to basket, from basket to stall, from stall to kitchen, from kitchen to table. Delay anywhere creates risk. By late afternoon, the market thins. The best goods are gone. Prices on fragile items may fall because sellers would rather accept less than carry spoiled produce home. Now bargaining becomes interesting. A piece of fruit that was expensive in the morning may be cheap because it has only hours of useful life remaining. You can save money if you know how to use it immediately. That creates opportunities for poorer buyers. It also creates risk. Cheap food may be cheap for a reason. You inspect carefully, smell, touch, look, decide. You carry your purchases home as evening approaches. There is no large reserve waiting. What you hold is meant for the next meals. That creates a strange closeness between appetite and marketplace. Dinner still carries the noise of the street. The greens were alive in soil not long ago. The loaf came from today's oven. The fish came through the gate this morning. Freshness is immediate, local, and fragile. You set the basket down. The room smells of bread, onions, herbs, and dust from the road. Nothing has a printed date. Nothing is wrapped in plastic. Nothing promises how long it will remain safe. You simply know that food is always changing, so you watch it. You smell it. You cook what needs cooking. You share what cannot wait. You return to the market when the basket is empty. And tomorrow, you begin judging all over again. You stand on the edge of an ancient road and watch a line of pack animals moving toward the horizon. Their burdens are not glamorous. There are no jeweled crowns strapped to the saddles, no marble statues, no heroic banners snapping dramatically in the wind. There are sacks of grain, bundles of dried fruit, jars of oil, cured meat, hard cheese, salted fish, food that has been persuaded to survive distance. That may be the greatest achievement of ancient preservation. It does not merely make supper last longer. It changes what human beings are capable of doing. A fresh fish belongs close to the water and close to the moment it is caught. A preserved fish can travel for days. Fresh grapes belong to harvest season. Raisins can cross mountains. Milk belongs to the morning it is collected. Cheese can remain useful long after that morning disappears. Once food begins surviving time, it also begins surviving geography. Trade expands. You can exchange goods with people who live far beyond the fields you know. A merchant carrying preserved food does not need to sell everything immediately. That flexibility matters. Imagine trying to conduct long-distance trade with baskets full of delicate, fresh berries. Your commercial empire would become jam somewhere around the first rough road. Durable foods are better travellers. Records confirm that preserved foods became major trade goods across the ancient world. Olive oil moves through Mediterranean ports. Wine travels in ceramic vessels. Salted fish and fish sauces cross regional boundaries. Dried fruits follow caravan route. Grain moves by ship, cart, river, and animal. These goods connect agricultural regions with cities and distant markets. Preservation makes specialization easier. A coastal settlement can produce more fish than it consumes locally, because some of that fish can be processed and sold inland. A wine-producing region can export its harvest in liquid form. An olive-growing district can convert fruit into oil that stores and travels far better than fresh olives. You begin to see preservation as a form of economic compression. A field becomes grain in sacks. A vineyard becomes wine in jars. An orchard becomes dried fruit. A flock becomes cheese. A catch becomes salted fish. The landscape is converted into portable value. Merchants understand this very well. So do governments. Taxes can be collected in durable foods. Rations can be stored. Workers can be paid. Surplus can be moved toward places where it is needed. A city therefore becomes less dependent on food grown immediately outside its walls. That changes urban life. Large populations consume food constantly. The city itself produces relatively little of what it eats. Every morning, mouths open. Every evening, they expect to be fed again. A city is, in that sense, a very impressive machine for turning countryside into dinner. Preservation helps keep that machine functioning. Grain can arrive from distant farms. Oil can cross the sea. Wine can survive transport. Dried or salted foods can sit in warehouses. Markets can carry products from regions ordinary citizens may never visit. This makes cities more resilient, but also more dependent on transport networks. A blocked road matters. A damaged harbour matters. A war in a grain-producing province matters. The larger the city, the more invisible connections lie behind a simple meal. You sit at a table with bread, oil, cheese, and dried fruit. The meal appears modest, yet each item may represent a chain of farmers, herders, processors, potters, sailors, merchants, porters, officials, and shopkeepers. Preservation binds those people together. It also feeds armies. This is where food becomes almost aggressively unromantic. Military history likes cavalry charges, shining armour, siege towers, and generals pointing confidently at maps. But an army spends far more time eating than charging. Thousands of soldiers need food every day. They need it while marching. They need it while waiting. They need it during sieges. They need it when local harvests are unavailable. Fresh provisions alone are unreliable. So durable foods become military necessities. Grain can be ground when needed. Hard breads can travel. Salted meat survives longer. Dried legumes provide compact nourishment. Cheese keeps better than fresh milk. Wine or other fermented drinks can be transported. A marching army becomes a moving stomach with weapons attached. One curious footnote is that military commanders sometimes worry more about supply lines than about the enemy directly in front of them. A brilliant battlefield plan means very little if thousands of soldiers are hungry, exhausted, and are arguing over the final sack of grain. Preservation therefore influences where armies can go and how long they can remain there. A force carrying durable provisions can move farther from friendly farmland. A navy can remain at sea longer. A garrison can endure isolation. A besieged city can survive if its stores hold. And then that last condition turns preservation into a weapon. Siege warfare is partly a contest over time. Attackers surround a city and try to cut supply. Defenders depend on whatever has been stored within the walls. Grain becomes strategic. Salted foods become strategic. Water becomes strategic. The question is not simply whether walls are strong, it is whether the people behind them can continue eating. A fortress with magnificent defences and empty storerooms is merely a very secure place to become hungry. Preservation also reshapes the calendar of daily life. Seasonal abundance no longer disappears completely when the season ends. Summer fruit can reach winter in dried form. Autumn grain can feed spring labourers. Meat processed during colder months can remain available later. Fermented vegetables provide plant foods when gardens are bare. The ancient diet still changes strongly with the seasons, but preservation softens the sharpest edges. That creates a different relationship with time. You eat the past. A handful of raisins contains last summer. A bowl of grain contains last harvest. A piece of cured meat carries the memory of an earlier slaughter. Food becomes a bridge between seasons. This matters especially during what agricultural communities sometimes experience as a hungry interval, when old stores are shrinking but new crops are not yet ready. Those weeks can be dangerous. A successful harvest is reassuring. A successful storage year is survival. The distinction matters. Growing food is only half the task. Keeping it is the other half. Preservation also creates social differences. Not everyone eats the same preserved foods. Some techniques require expensive ingredients. Honey is valuable. Imported spices are costly. Fine oil may be reserved for households with money. Access to ice and snow can become a luxury. Large storage rooms require space. Specialized workers require wealth. A poor household may depend heavily on grain, legumes, dried vegetables, and inexpensive salted foods. A wealthy household can choose among wines, preserved fruits, aged cheeses, imported sauces, and carefully stored delicacies. The pantry becomes a map of status. You enter an elite storeroom and see rows of imported vessels. Some carry painted marks identifying contents or origins. There are foods from distant regions. The owner can serve guests something unusual and make a social point without saying a word. A rare, preserved fruit announces connections. An expensive sauce announces taste. Chilled wine announces access to labour and infrastructure. Humans discover remarkably early that dinner can be used to show off. One scandalous aside is that elite writers sometimes complain bitterly about luxurious preserved foods, imported delicacies, and extravagant banquets while describing them in enough detail to make clear that they have been paying very close attention. Moral outrage and appetite make comfortable companions. Preservation can even influence identity. A region becomes associated with a particular cheese. A town becomes known for fish sauce, a valley produces famous wine, a community develops a distinctive dried meat. Local methods become local pride, visitors recognize flavors, merchants advertise origins, families protect techniques, food preservation stops being merely defensive, it becomes tradition. And tradition can survive long after the original necessity weakens. You may prefer a smoked flavor even when refrigeration makes smoking unnecessary. You may crave pickled vegetables when fresh ones are available. You may buy dried fruit because you enjoy it, not because winter leaves you no choice. Many foods born from preservation eventually become foods people would miss if preservation were no longer required. Necessity creates flavor. Flavor creates memory. Memory creates culture. Scholars still argue whether food preservation should be treated mainly as a technological force driving larger societies, or as one element within a much broader web of farming, trade, climate, warfare, labor, and political organization. The cautious answer is that no single technique builds civilization by itself. Salt does not invent cities. Drying does not create empires. Fermentation does not automatically produce governments. But together, preservation methods make large and complex societies easier to sustain. They increase flexibility. They reduce immediate dependence on daily harvests. They support movement. They allow surplus to accumulate. And surplus changes almost everything. Once food can be stored, someone can own more than they need today. Someone can distribute it tomorrow. Someone can trade it. Someone can tax it. Someone can steal it. Someone can guard it. Someone can promise it in exchange for work. Stored food becomes economic power because hunger is universal. That fact remains quietly present beneath many ancient institutions. A temple storehouse can support workers. A palace can distribute grain. A merchant can profit from scarcity. A household can survive because jars remain full. Power may wear gold, but it often eats barley. Yet preservation is not always successful. This is important. Ancient methods extend usefulness, but they do not abolish spoilage. A jar leaks, a cellar floods, a shipment warms, mold appears, salt is insufficient, insects spread, a storage pit takes in rain. A merchant opens a container after a long journey and discovers that nature has ignored the business plan entirely. Loss remains normal. People therefore preserve more than they expect to need when possible. Redundancy becomes protection. Different foods are stored in different ways. If one method fails, another supply may survive. Grain in one place, dried fruit in another. Animals still alive in the field. Cheese in storage. Salted fish in jars. Food security comes partly from diversity. You do not put every hope into one container. The same principle applies across regions. A society relying heavily on a single crop or supply route becomes vulnerable. Diverse sources provide resilience. Trade can rescue a region after a poor harvest, but trade can also fail during war. Local stores can protect against interruption, but local stores eventually empty. Nothing guarantees safety. Preservation simply improves the odds, and perhaps that is its deepest historical role. It gives humans room to plan. Without preserved food, attention remains trapped by immediate need. What can you eat today? Where can you find it? How quickly must you consume it? Preservation opens different questions. What will you need next month? What can you carry on a journey? How much should be saved for winter? How many workers can be supported? How far can a ship sail? How long can a city endure? Food begins participating in the future. You walk through an ancient storeroom one final time. There is no single miracle here, only many small solutions. A sack of grain, a jar of oil, a wedge of cheese, a string of dried fruit, a piece of salted fish, a vessel of sour vegetables. Each looks ordinary. Together, they represent one of humanity's greatest quiet accomplishments. People learn that decay can be slowed, water can be removed, microbes can be guided, cold can be borrowed, salt can reshape food, containers can create barriers, time can be negotiated. And because food can wait, people can travel, trade, build, gather, fight, celebrate, survive poor seasons, support cities, and imagine lives that extend beyond tomorrow's meal. The techniques are simple by modern standards. Their consequences are enormous. The storeroom grows quiet now. The road outside empties, and the final pack animals disappear into evening haze. Somewhere, a jar cools against stone. Grain rests beneath a lid. Dried fruit gives off a faint sweetness. The last warmth of the day slips slowly from the walls. You no longer need to think about markets, armies, harvests, or distant ships. For now, the food is safe enough. The doors are closed, the baskets are covered, the jars stand where careful hands have placed them. You can let the ancient world settle into darkness without following every sound. A soft breeze moves through the doorway. Dust rests. Wood stops creaking. Even the restless little scratch of a mouse seems to fade. Nothing here must last forever. It only needs to last long enough, and tonight, that is enough. The lamps dim, the room cools, and the stored harvest waits quietly for morning.